EQ versus IQ. Can empathy be trained? Reacting to the pandemic, how companies have fared. Transitioning to a remote workforce. Today, I have Adrian Swinscoe with me. He's a Forbes contributor, book author of Punk CX. But, of course, since recording this interview, he's got a new book called Punk XL, which you really need to have a look at. Links to it are in the notes below. I met Adrian at an event in Amsterdam in 2019, a true punk on stage with a great presence. I really enjoyed his humor, but his dry take on the situation in business and their employees and the needs of not only the businesses, employees, and customers, but also the stakeholders as well. And this is something we talk about today. Hello, my name is Andrew Mayer, and welcome to the New Normal podcast. This podcast is about innovating and innovation in these ever-changing times. This interview was recorded in October 2020. Yeah, 18 months ago. This interview was a collection of interviews you will see in the coming weeks, which were conducted in late 2020, but never saw the light of day. I could share my excuses here, but the point is, I was a bit lost. I'd lost my job at the height of the initial pandemic and wanting to restart my podcasting, but underestimating the effort it takes. And I kept seeing a list of finished interviews and kept feeling overwhelmed with the work it was going to take to get them out. And I just resigned. I share this as many people have been having a tough time in the last months and years. I, too, have been challenged to get up in the morning, get to work. One thing which helps me is to turn off the noise. Not to stick my head in the sand and ignore what's all going around me, but closing myself off for periods of time to focus on what's good for me. And it works. For those of you who listen to my podcast, I appreciate you. Knowing who you are, since this is a podcast, is tough. But I do occasionally hear a comment or a reference to an older podcast. And thank you. Stay safe, stay healthy. Now, off to my conversation with Adrian Swinscoe, the Experience Anthropologist. Customer experience is more than effing metrics, is what you got up on stage and spoke about. And I was like bowing down to to the stage while you were on stage punking it away and putting on a grand show. I'd like to talk to you about empathy. Mm-hmm. And designing experiences, because empathy is something I've not spent a lot of time talking about. I feel I've spent a lot of time practicing. But I want to hear your side of it, how you are employing it in your businesses there, in your consultancies. This is October 2020. I don't need to tell anybody listening to this podcast of what's happening in the world. You've had a pretty good 2020, I think.
I was like anybody else. When it all happened and it all kicked off, I was a bit like, whoo, how the hell is this going to play out? And I had a whole bunch of work, like stuff that was lined up with with clients just get completely shelved. Stuff that was in the pipeline just got cancelled, postponed, just disappeared. Luckily, I had a couple of kind of clients where the stuff could be flipped and be done remotely. And so that kept me going in terms of momentum, kept the wheels on my bus. And meant that I didn't completely freak out, just going, oh my. But then gradually, as I was watching what's going on and doing the work, and I was writing and carrying on, as it were, then a whole bunch of stuff kind of kept came back to me. So things like workshops and roundtables and speaking and all these different sort of things. And so actually, I've been pretty busy because, kind of interestingly enough, when we met, it was just right after I published this kind of most recent book called Punk CX, which was like a real sort of back to basics, sort of like, pull your socks up and do better work sort of thing. And the crisis that we've faced has just kind of went, and we've just zoomed in on that, right? And people have gone, oh, you know that thing that we said was important to us? It now really is important to us.
It's really important to us.
So that's been kind of good because it's really helped me stay relevant, as it were. But that ignores almost the hinterland of stuff that I've had like 12 years at this. Like I mentioned to you before, I was like, I feel like I've built a I'm building, or I've grown like this evergreen tree with deciduous roots.
Mm-hmm.
And almost that's the foundations of it. So, having a past, having a history, always being relevant, but staying kind of like in front of things and being kind of timely. I'm in good shape, and I feel very grateful and very fortunate about that, because I know there's many other people that operate independently in this space where their work has like disappeared. So I am not counting my chickens, as it were. So I'm just keeping on and trying to do good work, say things that are relevant and valuable and useful to kind of people in a sort of a real kind of open source. I do a lot of the stuff I do with my writing, my podcasting, everything is just thinking out loud.
Yep.
And trying to discover things or put things together that I hope is of use and of value to other people. I'm not trying to sell anything. I'm just trying to sort of make sense of stuff.
Make sense of stuff. So I'm happy to hear that. There's a university professor in New York, Scott Galloway, and shortly after this virus broke out in the United States, he made a statement that what businesses had in their 10-year plan, that was pulled forward by 10 years, and they had to execute on now at that point. So the idea of remote agents or people working from home, ideas of putting things into the cloud, whatever it may have been, were suddenly pulled all forward. We have to do these things now. Mm-hmm. And you work with companies to help them understand how to organize yourself, how to build teams, groups, organizations, structures that function. And one of the things that what I said I wanted to talk to you about was about designing of experiences there and how companies. What are you talking to your companies about?
So I think you touched on an important kind of thing, and I think it's that there's this massive move to remote working where it's been possible, and I think there's a kind of an overlap. There's the people that can work remotely, and then there's the people that can't, and then there's another group that sit in the center, which it's like you could, but you haven't, because people have not been able to figure it out or not been kind of like courageous enough to do it, or like so on and so forth. And so you've got different kind of groups. And I think the thing that we kind of need to acknowledge is there's a lot of conversation that goes on about the stresses and strains of remote working and the shift to digital and everything. And it's all, the fact that we've been able to do it and it's been fueled by necessity and adrenaline and all these different sort of things. And we got there, and now we've got to figure out what's the stable, steady state sort of thing, right? So that's kind of one thing. But what we need to also acknowledge is the people that can't work remotely and have had to do so under different conditions as well, and how that's put different stresses and strains on both organizations and the people themselves and their kind of leadership and systems and everything and everything else. And also they're under strain by customers as well, who are dealing with this new environment as well in both domains. And then you get the people that are stuck in the middle, and you're like going, yeah, I feel for you. Because you're stuck in the middle. And so it's like, there's almost a bit like the two domains, whether you're on that kind of, the two extremes, whether you can't work remotely, therefore you have to work on site, in your office or workplace, and all of the things that need to change to facilitate that, given all the conditions we're dealing with. And it's the same kind of when you're working remotely. All of those different changes have to be designed, as it were. And most of the design is getting done on the fly.
Yep.
And it's just kind of people are focusing on doing what is the right thing at the right time and for the right reasons. And given that, and that's the intent, as it feels to me. Now, many people are getting many things wrong. But I think that's okay when the intent is fine. And if you're willing to go, actually, you know what, we're going to try this, and it might not work.
Right.
But we think it's the right thing to do. Right. Now, and as long as you're willing to design something and then listen and be open to not getting it right and being willing to sort of to change fast, the very epitome of this idea of being agile and adaptable and learning and things. Because what this environment has shown us is that we don't know squat about what's happening tomorrow. So we have to operate today. We have to almost like be present all the time. Every day we have to show up. Like you said, is that 10 years has happened in kind of like 10 weeks. I think that's like a paraphrasing of a quote from Lenin, where he talks about things that sometimes we expect to take decades can happen in a matter of weeks and months at certain kind of points in time. I think what this time has shown us is that actually design is not about getting things kind of right. It's about doing things with conviction and with intent, but being willing to be wrong about things and to do things kind of incrementally, as it were, and being able to kind of, to change. And so that's been very, very interesting. But I think where we've also seen frailties and all that type of stuff is where people have tried to do too much, as it were. And you talk about, people complaining about bad service. And this was true before the pandemic as well as during the pandemic, is that you have all these kind of companies that are trying to add new things like self-service facilities and all these different things, right? So you're trying to add to your mix with the same level of resources, and all you get is you're trying to do more with less, with the same amount of resources. So, and it was almost like per capita, you're getting less done in many ways, right? And so what you're doing is you're stretching your resources even further. It's not as if people were fundamentally investing huge amounts more into customer service, customer support, and all this sort of thing. They were just going, look, we're going to add some stuff. Yeah.
Why is experiences, particularly in the customer experience place, often seen so negatively?
One of the most stark things is that prior to this sort of period, I mean, you go back to the early part of this year, there was a number of things that were going on, but for me, one of the biggest things was like, there was a huge amount of rhetoric saying that, service and experience and our customers are really important to us. We put them at the center of our decision making and everything else. And then you kind of like compare that to how much activity is actually going in that. So like, or how much investment and commitment and things. And so there was a real gap. And that's persisted for some time. People are like, oh yeah, that's going to be important. That's important. That's important. But actually kind of when the rubber hits the road, actually the thing that's important are quarterly numbers and share prices and all this kind of other kind of like stuff. Important as it is, but actually what they hadn't done is they hadn't built that whole picture. And actually what we've seen this last kind of few months is we've seen that for many companies, that gap between the rhetoric and activity absolutely collapse. And people are going, oh, that thing we said it was important? Yeah, now it sort of is. Right? And so I think reality has bitten many organizations. And then it's not just about customer service and customer experience. It's also about how organizations show up in the world, how they treat their employees, how they interact with their communities, how they stand for where they stand on certain kind of like social kind of issues, where they stand on things like climate change and things, and the thing that I wrote this piece back in July after sort of just sitting and watching kind of all this stuff kind of develop. And it seemed to me that I call it like watching the tectonic plates of consumer and business.
Okay.
Tectonic plates of consumer and business kind of behavior kind of change. And the things that were showing up for me, that was just for me. And this is not kind of, doesn't need to be right. And I said, the first thing that showed up for me was is the idea that we all need to learn more and learn faster because things are changing so far. It's not about being agile or adaptable or anything else, because we can quickly reduce something down to a process and still be dumb, right? We can be master of a process and still be dumb. So it's not about the process, and it's not about terminology. It's about how much do we learn about stuff and how quickly we can do that, and how does that help us? Whether that's through developing new services and experiences or new products, or kind of like how do we kind of like change our employee environment, and how do we learn about ourselves and all that sort of like stuff. So that's kind of one thing. And that's always been around, but it's just been really accentuated right now. The other thing was about resilience, and about the idea of like, we need to look after what we've already got.
Right.
Because the behavioral data was showing that customers are like, if you think about it in terms of Maslow's kind of hierarchy of needs, people are just going, oh, we were up here, now we're down here. we're in that sort of like safety and protection, security sort of like space. And people selling kind of aspirational sort of stuff just kind of wasn't really landing. It's not really landing. And people like going, meh. I'm kind of like, I'm doubling down here sort of thing. And companies that don't get that and get that shift and think they can sell their way out of kind of trouble, I think will find that actually they might be on an uphill struggle. But actually companies that show up and prove themselves to be helpful and valuable and timely and all these different sort of things, they start to build better relationships, and they show up as being trusted and credible, reliable kind of partners, as it were. Yeah. And it's so then use your existing base as your growth engine. Now, it doesn't mean to say you can go off and sell and acquire new, but actually think about how you do that. And then I find that the next one was about, protection, which sort of speaks to the same thing. But resilience was also about the kind of the operating model and hybrids of it. But the final thing, which I think is important, it speaks to what I was saying about, is like, I think experience is now splitting out into 4 different dimensions. One is customer experience, and we know the importance of that and how that's getting recalibrated. The next one is employee experience, and how we know that is the importance of how those 2 things kind of fit together, and how we're having to redesign those sort of things and recalibrate all of those things given kind of where we're at. And the thing that's also showing up, and it sort of is part of that envelope of purpose and things, is stakeholder experience and how what our community kind of thinks about our place in the world as an organization. And our community is made up of both our customers, employees, and other people, right?
Sure.
And those things matter. And that's becoming a very, very important sort of like thing. And then the other one that actually showed up, which is kind of a bit of a surprise, but then also a bit like a duh, of course, was the idea that, and I think it's possibly an Achilles heel of many organizations, is that we need to start thinking about the experience of leaders.
Of the businesses.
Yes.
Okay.
And organizations, whether that is from a frontline supervisor level all the way up to kind of like C-suite. Now, because what actually has happened is we've asked the leaders in our business to look after our people so then they can go and do the jobs that need to do. Now, what we have to ask ourselves is who's looking after the leaders that are looking after the people? Right? Yeah, exactly. and the data supports this. The data from Gallup has shown that actually many people that have been able to continue their working and do it remotely, and companies have been afforded them all sorts of flexibility in order to do that, to accommodate kind of all the things they need to take care of, whether it's take care of a loved one or childcare, homeschooling, all that type of stuff, right? Engagement numbers have been going up for those employees. But interestingly, engagement numbers for leaders, particularly in that middle management, first line supervisors thing, and also all the way up to kind of like C-suite level, executive level, have been softening. Because the interesting thing is that we've moved from this early 2020 operating kind of model to late 2020 operating model. And we've made assumptions that the leaders we've got here in the early 2020 operating model have the same right capabilities and attitudes and aptitudes to operate in this new paradigm. That's a huge assumption to make.
Yep.
Hence all this kind of like stress and strain sort of thing. So we need to really look at it, because what we're learning is that we've created this new operating kind of model, which is one of many cases it's remote, but actually it'll probably be a hybrid kind of model that will kind of combine sort of remote and on-site for many companies. And I think that's the thing, is we need to think about how do we support leaders to operate in that new environment. And that's been completely overlooked. And it's the Achilles heel for many organizations.
I've seen so little written on that, actually.
Yeah.
Very little.
It's just like, I've spoken to some people about it, and it's just something I spotted and I just thought about it. I was like going, yeah, no, that's it. And it's a thing that people just don't know how to tackle it right now.
Sounds like you've got a new book in the works.
I'm fortunate enough to be able to have time thinking about this sort of stuff and trying to join the dots. So I think the leader experience is one thing. I think that you talked about empathy before, that idea about all of the stresses and strains that have shown up, whether you're talking about employees and how leaders and management deal with employees and employees deal with customers, and that everything in the round,
Right.
how to be more empathetic, is that the requirement for that is just gone through the roof. But the trick is that, yes, we all have an innate ability to be empathetic, but some people are better at it than others. And the problem is that we know that research shows us that under stress, or if we're not paying attention, we default to not being empathetic.
Caveman principle.
Yeah, and also kind of from a, I guess, kind of neurological perspective, we default to thinking about ourselves, and because empathy requires us to switch our brain on, and so, I think
so we mean this in a polite way right now.
Well, of course. I mean, the thing is, we are programmed to do rather than to think. That's why we develop habits, right? We say that our brain is like a muscle, right? But it consumes roughly about 40% more energy than any other muscle in our body. If our first instinct is to survive, and then survival also equates to energy conservation, it means we choose not to switch our brain on.
So all these experiences we're having with cold machines are all by design. I mean, it's just the way human nature is meant to be.
Yeah, well, I kind of think but that doesn't mean to say that we're not kind of like brighter and cleverer and more capable than that. We can learn this sort of like stuff.
You've written about empathy training, and you've expanded on that whole subject matter now that you've got a larger framework around empathy and what that means.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's the danger that we have with all this sort of stuff is people go, oh, we need to be more empathetic. Right, fine. Sign us all up for kind of like a course on empathy.
Right. Empathy
like going,
101.
Oh, crumbs. It's a bit like going, oh, I use the analogy of like, you don't just get up in the morning and to go run a marathon, right? You got to go buy some shoes. You got to get some kit. You got to get a training program. You got to eat right. You got to train for a period. You got to find a marathon. You got to do all this sort of stuff, right? And that's your journey to becoming a marathon runner. And the same thing as with empathy, I think that we can't just do it by getting a course, because that becomes like a tick box exercise. Actually, we've got to think a bit bigger. And I've been thinking about this idea, but we need to build an empathetic musculature. And that means this is almost like a system at an individual level, but also at an organizational level that thinks about that thinks about, okay, what's my strategy around this? How empathetic do I want to be? How does it fit? And empathy doesn't mean to say that, I'm all fluffy and nice and kind of like all the time sort of thing. Empathy might just be, I'm like this because that's what you want and that's what you're going to get, right? It's like going, I ask something, you tell me the answer, that we're done. That's because that's almost the value proposition that you're offering, because you're not kind of wasting my time. You are recognizing this. I come to you for X and you give me exactly that X. And that can be empathetic. But then, so you can think about what's the strategy, then you think about what's the people side of things, the capabilities and the training and the support that you need for the process that goes around with it, and technology that supports all these. And it becomes a systematic sort of way of thinking about it, about how you dial being more empathetic into the whole way of doing kind of business.
Do you think organizations can have their employees increase their levels of empathy? Is that something that's possible?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think you can do it through training, and you do it through practice, and you do it through all these different things. You can also have technology that helps. There's some super cool stuff out there.
Okay.
Whether there is kind of auto-suggestive, text-based type stuff. There's even some stuff that I've known about for a few years now. There's an organization, particularly in that service and support sort of call center, contact center sort of space. There's a piece of technology that comes out of it's a spin out of MIT Media Lab with a guy it's based on some work by Professor Sandy Pentland, wrote a book called Social Physics, and a guy that was studying there, a guy called Joshua Feast, and they put together this spin out called Cogito. So it's Cogito. if you haven't heard of them, this is what they do. Check this out. You're a contact center agent, right? You're taking kind of calls. They have this little application that sits on your desktop, and it listens to both sides of a conversation in real time. There is no sort of translation and text analytics, and they're just doing it. This technology listens to the voice signals in real time, and it provides real-time EQ coaching prompts to the agent about the conversation that they're having to help them have a better conversation. Like, it tells them things like, why don't you kind of like slow down a little bit? Why don't you ask more questions? Why do you let that kind of, don't interrupt, let that person kind of like finish, kind of like speaking, and so on and so forth. And it does this in real time.
So it's your own coach sitting there next to you.
Real-time coach.
On your desktop doing.
On your desktop, coaching in real time. What it does, it closes that kind of experience gap, and it closes the empathy gap. Particularly, it works particularly well where you end up with this like kind of almost a demographic or experience kind of gap, where there's difficult conversations. I've seen some incredible results where old people were calling their health insurer about questions they had about kind of health or this or that or the other. And they were generally speaking to younger people that were manning the phones. And they're like this, they're like, the difference in age is probably somewhere in the region of like 40 years. And what this app does, it just goes and just reduces that gap. And it's some of the results they produce into the outcomes is just like mind blowing. But the technology is just like, yeah, that stuff that would fit in that empathetic musculature in the technology slot that would help people do it. And because you're kind of training to do it, it actually raises your overall kind of ability and performances. Like, you're basically training that muscle all the time. One
of my questions that I ask all of my guests is, what does innovation mean to you?
I like innovative stuff that produce like better outcomes, but I do also think that there's a lot of the things that fall under innovation or the category of innovation in kind of many organizations, particularly large organizations, is like a waste of money and a waste of time. I think many large organizations innovation becomes this other thing. It becomes a process rather than actually trying to find something. And so I think we've seen lots of large organizations that are actually starting to get this. They understand the way that they've done innovation for the longest period of time is just rubbish. It does not work. And they're trying to take a bit more of an innovative approach to the process of innovation, if that works.
So, final question, bearish or bullish? Are you positive or negative? Are companies or organizations really going to make some fundamental changes in the next 5 years?
I'm optimistic about the future and the possibilities of the future, but I'm concerned that I'm going to still have the same frustrations and the same concerns in 5 years' time as I do now. The thing we have to do is not necessarily get too carried away around about ideas around kind of, sunlit uplands and all that type of stuff. And actually, we just need to focus on the discipline of progress. Like you said earlier on, it's about this kind of 10-year plans. 10-year plans are pretty much useless, right? And they have been for years now. If anything, people should be focusing on, fast turnover quarterly plans. I know I talked about this idea about being an anthropologist, service and experience anthropologist. More importantly, I know in myself that I'm in service to service. That's it.
Mic drop, I think, at that point. I appreciate the chance always to have a chance to conversation with you, and hopefully others listening to the podcast will take a couple of things away. Adrian, thank you for your time today.
You're very welcome. Thanks, Andrew. Always a pleasure.